My brother sent me a bill for not helping with mom's care. I sent him 3 years of real receipts. My brother sent an itemized email on a Tuesday morning and copied my parents. He said I owed the family $14,000 for my share of our mother's care, that I never showed up, never contributed, never did my part. My mother forwarded it with 4 words. My father used a phrase I hadn't heard before and haven't forgotten since. I replied once. Then, I went quiet. What none of them knew was that I had been the one paying the facility directly every month for 3 years, and that the moment my brother called to complain about the bills, a billing coordinator was going to read him a name he wasn't expecting. Receipt. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every week. This is an original fictional story created for entertainment purposes. All names, characters, and events are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental. Hashtag family revenge, hashtag she finally said no, hashtag family drama, hashtag elder care, hashtag true story time. Section 4, Full Story. My name is Celeste Okafor. I'm 30 years old. And the Tuesday morning I opened my email and found my brother's itemized list was when I finally understood that the people who demand an accounting are rarely prepared to see one. The subject line said, "Family matter, please read." The body was 9 bullet points. Each one assigned a dollar value to a category of care my brother had decided I had failed to provide: transportation to appointments, coordination with staff, presence at family meetings, emotional support during transitions. At the bottom, in bold, the total, $14,000. And below that, pay up or we're done. My mother had forwarded it 11 minutes later. Her addition was one line: "He's right. You never show up." My father called that afternoon. He did not ask for my side. He said, in the even tone he used for things he considered already decided, "You've made yourself a stranger who shares our name." I typed one reply to my brother's email. It said, "I'm not going to pay this." I sent it and closed the thread. What none of them knew, what I had not told any of them because I had learned that telling my family things meant those things became resources to be managed, was that for the previous 37 months, I had been paying my mother's residential care facility directly. Not supplementing. Paying. The monthly invoice from Hargrove Place came to my email address, was reviewed by me, and was settled by a recurring bank transfer in my name before the 15th of every month. The account at Hargrove Place listed one authorized payer. That name was mine. My brother was about to call the facility to complain about the bills. I did not warn him. Let me tell you who my family is, because the structure of what happened requires it. My mother, Pauline, is 64. She has a progressive neurological condition, not the kind that arrives suddenly, but the kind that redraws the map gradually, the way a coastline changes. You look up one day and notice the shape is different from what you remember. She was diagnosed when I was 24 and she was 58, and the early years were manageable enough that she stayed in the house in the western district of the city where I grew up, a house that my parents had bought in their 30s and that my father, Roland, had lived in continuously since. Roland is 67. He worked for 30 years as a regional transportation coordinator for a municipal authority and retired at 62 with a pension that covered the house and their baseline expenses without difficulty, which is relevant to what comes later. My brother, Garrett, is 34. He is 4 years older than me, lives 20 minutes from the family house, and has, for as long as I can remember, occupied the position in our family that is held by the person who is most present and loudest, and therefore assumed to be the one who is doing the most. This assumption is not always wrong. In Garrett's case, it was almost entirely wrong, but it had been true for long enough and repeated often enough that it had become the family's working reality, and working realities are harder to dislodge than facts. I grew up understanding that I was the other one. Not lesser. My parents were not cruel in that way, but secondary in the sense that Garrett's needs, his plans, his difficulties, and his minor victories occupied the center of the family's attention with a consistency that made them feel like weather, always present, shaping everything, not chosen. I was good at school without being asked. I kept my own schedule. I did not require intervention. In a family that was moderately stretched in the usual ways, time, attention, the particular friction of two working adults managing a household and two children who were genuinely different from each other, being self-sufficient was treated as a gift I was giving them, which is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that I was, from a very early age, learning to be invisible in order to survive. I studied health services administration at the university in the northern part of the city, commuted for 2 of 4 years, graduated at 22 with a 3.79 GPA, and a conditional offer from a regional hospital network that I accepted before graduation. I started as a patient services coordinator at Meridian Health Network at a salary of $44,000 a year. I was 22, and I thought the job would teach me how healthcare administration actually worked, which it did, though not always in the ways I expected. By the time my mother's diagnosis arrived 2 years later, I had moved into a billing compliance role that paid considerably more and required me to understand, in granular detail, how care facilities invoiced, how insurance claims were processed, how payment responsibility was assigned, and where families typically encountered gaps between what they believed they were paying and what was actually being covered. This knowledge would become relevant in ways I could not have anticipated when I first acquired it. The first year after the diagnosis, my mother stayed home. My father managed the adjustments with the particular competence of someone who had spent 3 decades coordinating complex logistics and applied the same methodical attention to their domestic life. He tracked her appointments, adapted the house in small ways, maintained her routines. Garrett drove her to appointments when Roland couldn't. I visited on the 3rd Sunday of every month and called on Wednesdays, which were the days she was most alert and most herself. The arrangement worked until it didn't. The point at which it stopped working was not a single event, but a gradient that steepened over about 6 months in my mother's 3rd year post-diagnosis. Her mobility became inconsistent. Her sleep fragmented in ways that disrupted Roland's rest to a degree that was becoming medically concerning for him separately. Garrett's driving availability, which had been reliable when his work schedule permitted, became less so after he changed employers and took on a longer commute. The Wednesday calls got harder to time correctly. I started researching residential care facilities in the spring of that year. Not because anyone asked me to, no one asked me to do most of the things I did in my family, but because I understood the trajectory and because my professional background made me faster at reading facility disclosures, inspection records, and billing structures than most people would be. I identified 4 facilities within a reasonable distance of the family home and ranked them on a set of criteria I had developed from the inspection data and from conversations with 2 colleagues in elder care coordination, a woman named Josephine Tarr and a man named Derek Wills, both of whom had spent years working the interface between families and residential care and knew which facilities' numbers corresponded to their reputations and which ones did not. Hargrove Place was first on my list. It was not the least expensive option. It was the most consistent on the metrics that mattered: staff retention, inspection outcomes, medication error rates, family satisfaction scores, and it had a billing structure that was transparent in ways that most facilities were not, which I knew from professional experience was either a genuine operational choice or a marketing decision, and in Hargrove's case the inspection record suggested it was genuine. I brought the research to a family dinner in early summer. I had a printed summary, 2 pages, facility comparison table, key metrics, cost ranges. I put it on the table the way my mother used to put difficult things on the table, matter of fact, without preamble. My father looked at it for a long time. Garrett picked it up and set it down again, without reading past the first section. My mother was having a better day, and was at the table with us and looked at the papers, and then at me with an expression I recognized as the one she used when she wanted to say something she wasn't sure she had the right to say. "You've been doing research," she said. "Yes," I said. "For a while." "Since March," I said. She nodded slowly. Garrett said he thought it was too soon to be looking at facilities. My father said he wasn't sure they could afford it. I said the cost range was on page 2, and that I wanted to talk about how to cover it. Garrett said he'd need to look at his budget. My father said his pension covered the house and their expenses, but not something this significant without adjustment. I said I would cover the gap. No one asked me what I meant by that. I think, in the way families process things at the table versus later, alone, they heard different versions of what I had said. My father may have heard that I would contribute. Garrett may have heard that I would help with a portion. What I had meant, and what I had already decided before I sat down at that table, was that I was going to pay the monthly invoice at Hargrove Place in full from my own account, and I was going to do it quietly, because I had run the numbers and I could manage it without material hardship to myself. And because the alternative was watching my mother go somewhere that wasn't right for her, because the right place cost more than the family could coordinate. I had not said this explicitly because I had learned, in 30 years of being in this family, that explicit offers were subject to renegotiation in ways that quiet facts were not. My mother moved to Hargrove Place in September. The intake coordinator, a careful woman named Sasha Dreyer, walked us through the billing setup. I provided my contact information as the authorized payer and my bank details for the recurring transfer. The monthly amount, at the private pay rate for my mother's level of care, was $4,380. Garrett was not in the room for the billing conversation. He had stepped out to take a call. For the next 3 years, I paid the invoice. My professional life during this period was not standing still. I had moved, by the time my mother entered Hargrove Place, from billing compliance into a senior role in healthcare contract administration at Meridian, managing a team of 6 and responsible for the accuracy of a contract portfolio that covered 17 facilities and 4 insurance carriers. The work required a particular kind of attention, the ability to hold a large number of variables simultaneously without losing track of the ones that mattered most. And I was, by most measures that my direct supervisor, a man named Aaron Thiessen, used to evaluate the role, good at it. Aaron was methodical and fair, and the kind of manager who gave feedback in writing so there was no ambiguity about what had been said. At my annual review in the second year, he noted that my error rate on contract variances was the lowest in the department and that I had identified a billing discrepancy in a long-term care contract that had saved the network a sum he specified in the review document as significant. He recommended me for a senior contract manager title and a corresponding salary adjustment. I accepted. I did not tell my family about the adjustment. I did not tell them, when the title changed, what the new title was. I mentioned, when my mother asked on a Wednesday call, that things at work were going well. She said she was glad. We talked about the new physical therapist at Hargrove, a young man she found encouraging, and about a book one of the nurses had recommended to her, and about the weather, which had been unusually mild. My visits to Hargrove were on the first Sunday of every month. I sat with my mother for 2 to 3 hours. I spoke with her care team when there were updates. I reviewed the monthly invoice when it arrived and checked it against the care plan because that was the kind of thing I did automatically and because it meant I always knew exactly what was being provided and whether it aligned with what had been agreed. There were 2 billing questions over 3 years that I raised with Sasha Dreyer's team. Both were resolved correctly and promptly, which confirmed my initial assessment of the facility. Garrett visited, as far as I could tell from my mother's mentions of him, irregularly. He came for her birthday in the first year and twice more that I heard about. He did not attend the care plan reviews. He was not on the billing account. My father visited more reliably, every other weekend, sometimes more. He and my mother had been married for 38 years, and the visits were, from what she described, quiet and consistent, and what she needed most. I do not discount what Roland did during those years. He showed up in the way he knew how to show up, and for my mother, that was not a small thing. What he did not know, because I had not told him, was who was paying. The email from Garrett arrived on a Tuesday in October, 37 months after my mother's move to Hargrove Place. I read it at my desk between 2 meetings. The 9 bullet points. The dollar values assigned to each category of absence. The total of $14,000. The ultimatum at the bottom. I read it twice. Then I read my mother's forward. Then I closed my laptop and went to the second meeting, which was a contract variance review with 2 members of my team and a representative from one of our carrier partners, a thorough man named Vincent Adler, who had been working with Meridian for 6 years. The meeting ran 40 minutes. I was present and accurate throughout. My father called at 4:15. I let it ring twice, then answered. He delivered his 3 sentences. I thanked him for calling and told him I would be in touch. I typed my reply to Garrett's email. I'm not going to pay this. I sent it and closed the thread. Then I did something I had been doing for 37 months. I opened the current month's invoice from Hargrove Place, which had arrived the previous Friday, and I reviewed it against the care plan. Everything was in order. I confirmed the recurring transfer would clear by the 15th. I closed the invoice. I did not call the facility. I did not warn Sasha Dreyer. I did not alert anyone to what I expected was coming. I made dinner. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. Garrett called the facility on Thursday. I know the details of that call because Sasha Dreyer called me afterward, professional and measured, to let me know that a family member had contacted the billing department with questions about the account and that she wanted to make sure I was aware and that everything on my end was in order. She said the caller had seemed surprised by some of the account information and had asked to speak with a supervisor, and that the supervisor, a man named Paul Ingram, had confirmed the account details from the authorized payer record. I asked Sasha if there was anything she needed from me. She said no, everything was current and the account was in good standing, and that she was calling as a courtesy because in her experience these situations were easier when the authorized payer knew they were happening. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her that if Garrett or anyone else from the family contacted the billing department again, she should feel free to provide them with whatever information was on the authorized account record, as I had no objection to them knowing it. She said she understood. We hung up. Garrett called me that evening at 7:43. I let it ring. He called again at 7:51. I let that one ring too. At 8:04, he sent a text. It said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at the text for a moment. Then I set my phone face down on the counter and finished the chapter of the book I was reading. At 9:15, I picked the phone back up and typed, "You have the billing information now. If you have questions about Mom's care plan, Sasha Dreyer's team at Hargrove can help." I sent it and put the phone on the charger. I went to sleep. The conversation with my father happened on Saturday. He called at 10 in the morning in the particular way he called when he had been sitting with something for 2 days and had organized his thoughts into a sequence he intended to deliver. I recognized the pacing of the call from the first sentence. He said, "I spoke with Garrett." I said, "I know." He called the facility. "I know that too." A pause. "Celeste, why didn't you tell us you were paying?" I had thought about this question because I had known it was coming. I had thought about the honest answer, which had several layers, and about which layer was the right one to give my father, who was 67 and had spent 38 years in a marriage and 30 years in a job and deserved, I thought, the true answer rather than the manageable one. Because I knew that if I said I was going to pay, it would become a negotiation. I said. About how much and for how long, and whether I could also cover something else. And I didn't want to negotiate. I just wanted Mom to be at a place that was right for her. Silence on his end. A long one. "We could have helped," he said. "I know," I said. But I didn't need help. I needed it to be simple. And the simplest thing was to pay and not discuss it. Another pause. His voice, when he spoke again, was different from the one he'd used on the Tuesday call. Lower, without the precision of something rehearsed. "What Garrett said to you in that email, and what I said." "Yes," I said. "That was wrong." "Yes," I said. "It was." A long breath on his end. The sound of the house in the background, the particular creak of the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator I had grown up with. "I didn't know," he said. "I should have known. That's different from not knowing, and I understand that. But I didn't." "I know you didn't," I said. We were quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of unresolved things, a different kind. The quiet that settles when two people have said what needed to be said and the air is changed, and there is nothing to do but sit in the new version of things for a minute before continuing. "Is the account current?" he said finally. Not because he doubted it, I could hear in the question that he knew it was, but because he needed to start somewhere concrete, and that was what he had. "Yes," I said. "The transfer cleared on the 12th. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said. We talked for another 20 minutes about my mother, her current care plan, a new occupational therapy component that Sasha's team had recommended and that I had approved the previous month, the therapist she found encouraging. Roland had been there the previous weekend and said she'd seemed well. I said I was glad. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a moment. Then I made coffee and sat at the table with the November light coming in flat and gray through the east window, the way it does in that month, and I reviewed the upcoming month's care plan document that Hargrove had sent the previous week. Everything was in order. There was a small adjustment to her physical therapy schedule that I flagged for a question, which I sent to Sasha's team by email. They responded by Monday morning with a clear explanation. I approved the change. The conversation with Garrett happened 9 days after the billing call, on a Sunday afternoon, at the family house on the west side of the city. My father had asked if I would come. I had said yes because I understood that some things needed to happen in person, and because I was not, despite everything, a person who avoided the necessary thing. The house was the same, the front hallway with a narrow table, the kitchen that smelled of the particular combination of coffee and something baking that it had always smelled of, the living room where the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows in long rectangles. Roland was in the kitchen when I arrived. Garrett was in the living room. He stood when I came in, which was not something he usually did. We sat down. Roland brought coffee. Garrett's hands were on his knees, and he was looking at a point near the window rather than at me directly. He said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "The email," he stopped, moved his hands from his knees to the armrests. I was angry. "I thought you'd been absent. I thought you didn't care." "I understand why you thought that," I said. "I was wrong." "Yes," I said. "You were." He looked at me then, not with the ease he usually had, with something more careful. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I gave him the same answer I had given my father, in slightly different words. He listened without interrupting, which was also not something he usually did. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The total," he said. "Over 3 years. 37 months, I said. "At the private pay rate." He did the arithmetic in his head, or started to, and then stopped. "That's..." "Yes," I said. Another pause. "I want to pay you back." I looked at him steadily. "You can't." "I could." "It's not about the money," I said. "The money is gone, and it went where it was supposed to go. What I need from you is different." He waited. "I need you to know what actually happened," I said. "Not the version where I was absent. The version where I was present in the only way that was available to me and that I was sure would actually work. I need that to be the version you carry." He was quiet for a long time. Roland's coffee cup made a small sound against the saucer. The west light had shifted and the rectangles on the floor were longer and more golden than they'd been when I sat down. "Okay," Garrett said. It was not an apology that undid anything. It was not the end of a long pattern of the family's assumptions about who is doing what. But it was true, and it was said in my father's house with my father present, and that was the version that would be carried forward. I finished my coffee. I stayed for another hour. Roland showed me the garden project he'd started in the back, a raised bed he was building for spring. We walked out and looked at it in the fading November light, the soil turned and waiting. He talked about what he planned to plant. I listened. We went back inside. I drove home along the western highway as the light went entirely and the city lights came on ahead of me. The radio played something quiet. I did not turn it off. In the months that followed, the structure of the family rearranged itself around the true version of things, the way water finds the actual shape of a container once you stop tilting it. Garrett began visiting Hargrove Place more regularly. I know this because my mother mentioned it on the Wednesday calls, not as a correction of anything but as news, the way you report things that are simply happening. He came on the second Saturday of the month. He stayed for 2 hours. He had, she said, learned the name of the physical therapist she found encouraging. Roland continued his every other weekend visits and added a Wednesday afternoon when his schedule allowed, which my mother said suited her, because Wednesdays were already her best days. I continued my first Sunday visits and my Wednesday calls. The overlap of our presences at Hargrove was not coordinated. It did not need to be. We were each doing what we could do, which turned out, when organized accurately, to be enough. At work, Aaron Thiessen brought me into a process review in the spring that had implications beyond my current role, a restructuring of how the network managed its long-term care contracts across all 17 facilities. He used a phrase in the kickoff meeting about wanting someone who understood both the numbers and the people the numbers represented, that I understood was directed at me. I nodded and did not say anything extra. I went back to my desk and began reading the contracts. The process review ran 4 months and produced a set of recommendations that I drafted with input from Vincent Adler on the carrier side and from a clinical compliance officer named Rosaria Venn, who had been at Meridian for 11 years and had the particular patience of someone who had seen a lot of processes fail for reasons that had nothing to do with the process. The recommendations were adopted. Aaron put my name first on the documentation. In the autumn, 14 months after Garrett's email, my mother had a good stretch. A period of 6 or 8 weeks where the trajectory that had been declining held steady, and then, in small ways that her care team noted and that I tracked from the monthly updates, tilted slightly better. The occupational therapy adjustment was cited as a contributing factor. Sasha Dreyer mentioned it on a call with something in her voice that sounded like the particular satisfaction of someone whose work had gone the way it was supposed to. I told my mother on a Wednesday call. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You approved that change." "Yes," I said. "You've been reading all the updates." "Every month," I said. Another pause. "I thought you didn't show up," she said. She said it the way you say something that has been sitting in you for a while, that you've been waiting for the right moment to say. I forwarded that email, Celeste. I said he was right. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." I held the phone and looked out at the November light through the east window, which was the same flat gray it always was in that month. "I know you are," I said. "Are we?" She stopped. "Yes," I said. "We are." We talked for another 40 minutes, the longest Wednesday call we'd had in 2 years. She told me about a book the librarian at Hargrove had ordered for her. I told her about the process review and what it had produced. She asked good questions. I answered them fully, which was something I had not done in a long time, the careful narrowing of what I shared having become so habitual that I had to consciously set it aside to speak at full size. When we hung up, I sat at the table for a while. The flat light had shifted slightly toward the west, the way it does in late afternoon in that season. I made tea. I reviewed the next month's care plan update that had come in that morning. Everything was in order. I sent one small question to Sasha's team. I closed the laptop. I sat with the tea and the quiet for a while, not thinking about anything specific. Just present in a room that was mine, in a life that had its correct shape, in a version of things that was finally, accurately, true. There is something that took me a long time to understand, which is that invisibility is not the same as absence. I had been invisible in my family for years, not because I was hiding, but because I had learned, early and thoroughly, that the quieter I was, the more smoothly things ran, and I had confused smooth with good. Smooth is just the surface. Good is what's underneath. And underneath what I had been doing for 37 months was a fact. My mother was at a place that was right for her, and she was having a good stretch, and someone had read every care plan update and asked the questions that needed asking and approved the change that her therapist recommended. That someone was me. That fact did not require an audience to be true, but it required, eventually, being known, not for the sake of credit, but for the sake of accuracy. Because the inaccurate version, the one where I was absent and Garrett was the one who showed up, was a version that had been used against me, and I was done carrying it. What you do in the quiet still counts. The question is whether you'll let the record stay wrong forever. That is the thing I held on to when my brother's email came. Not to prove something, not to win anything, just to let the record be corrected, and then to keep going. 37 months of payments. One facility call. A billing coordinator reading a name to my brother over the phone. A silence on his end that lasted long enough for everything he had believed to rearrange itself into something closer to the truth. I did not have to say a word. If you've ever been the one doing something real in your family while someone else got credit for showing up, I want to ask you something specific. There's a moment in this story, a Sunday afternoon, 2 of us in the living room, when my brother said, "I didn't know," and I said, "I know you didn't." Was that enough for you? Or did you need to hear more than that? Leave that in the comments. I read all of them. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and hit the bell. A new one comes every week, and I don't want you to miss it. This has been Celeste's story. Thank you for the time you gave it.